Well, hello everyone. This is Trent Blizzard. I am here with Kristen Blizzard. She is still fighting a nasty cold, so she is just going to lurk in the background and answer questions. And we're going to do a webinar today with Joseph Crawford. Say hi, Joseph. Well, let me stop the screen so they can see you there. Say hi, Joseph.
Hi, everyone.
Hello,
everyone.
Today we're going to talk about Matsutakis with Joseph. I feel like we should do a nice little introduction here, though. I guess so. First, we'll start by again welcoming everybody that's on the call or on the webinar. We already have about 25 people signed in here, first thing on time. That's a pretty good start. And I'll remind everybody, you can chat in here in Zoom. There's a chat button, and you can hit the chat, and you can address questions to us, and we'll try to answer them. I think we are watching for Joseph, though, so just send it to the panelists, and I'll feed them into Joseph. Already, we got a Joe, I love you from Daniel Barnum. We share the feeling, Daniel. We've known Joseph now, I don't know, 5 years maybe. And before I talk about you, Joseph, let me finish with the introduction here for everybody. So feel free to shoot us some questions. As we go on, we'll try to get them answered. We're going to post this up to YouTube and Facebook when it's over. It might be streaming to Facebook right now. I don't know. It's kind of a crapshoot. It may be there or it may not. However, we will stick it up there afterwards. So Joseph right now is in Eugene, Oregon, and we are in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And we met you, I think, originally through Facebook, and kind of somebody made an introduction to Facebook, and you went out hunting with us in, it was, I don't even know where it was that first year. And we started hunting together, Kristen and I, and you especially. And what was kind of, I guess, different is over the years, you have probably taught us more about foraging and mushrooms than any other person around. So first of all, thanks, Joseph, for sharing so much information with us over the years.
That's a big statement coming from you guys, considering how you get around. So thank you. That's really nice.
Yeah, you're definitely one of our favorite people to hunt with. Now I'm getting a little lag here. Are you doing okay, Joseph?
Yeah. I can go to a better spot if that's necessary. Everything seemed good before, but we weren't talking quite as much from my end. Is that coming through okay?
How about we get a little bit from the attendee or the panelists here and the participants, I should say. Give us a chat and let us know if you can hear everything okay right now. Because I feel like we're talking over each other just a little bit. Okay, we get a few people can hear okay. Mayumi's here. Hi, Mayumi, she can hear. All right. Joseph is lagging, a small lag. So we may have to have some extra signs to make sure that we kind of know what each other is saying. I think maybe a little more kind of introduction about you now. I'll tout your mad skills, since it's probably easier to have somebody else brag about you. Joseph is a classically trained chef. He graduated from CIA. If anybody's in chef school, you know what that is, out in Hyde Park, New York, a beautiful area. And he started foraging there when he was studying chefing things. I don't know what you call that, culinary arts, and moved out to Northern California for a while, and then Eugene, Oregon. And he hunts pretty hard up and down the coast and in the mountains, and knows a lot about mushrooms. And man, the guy can cook a meal in the woods like better than anybody. We've had some of our best food sitting around a campfire with you, Joseph. So I can't say enough about kind of the quality of the food that you produce with these mushrooms, and you've shown us kind of how to love these. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved, and or not involved, interested in the Matsutaki and what it means to you.
Gosh, I think my first time coming across a Matsutaki, I of course knew how expensive they were, and I knew that culture that drove them. But I was at a famous Berkeley grocery store once, and they had these giant #3 Matsutakis open, and they were just dinner plate sized Matsutakis, but they were only $20 a pound. And so we bought those and got a couple pounds of them, and it was kind of, I didn't know what to do with them. I had never cooked with them before, and we kind of played around with them, and I cooked them incorrectly. Essentially, this is probably fairly pre-internet, before it was completely saturated, maybe 15 or 20 years ago at least. And I just, it was interesting, but I wasn't in love with them. And then slowly over the next few years, I started to find them in my normal porcini habitats on the coast, hunting hedgehogs, black trumpets, porcini. Kind of couldn't really put my finger on the season or the habitat exactly, but I would occasionally find some Matsutaki here and there. And as time progressed, I became kind of obsessed with their elusiveness in the oak habitat, the rhododendron habitat. This is Sonoma coast, Mendocino coasts of California that I'd run across these things. And I'd eventually heard about them growing more dominantly in the Humboldt County coast, specifically the Lost Coast of California, they called it. And it was a really desolate area. And I eventually would go up there every year for a few days, often by myself, and get a commercial mushroom hunting pass and just go hardcore in the rainy, wet woods and pick them. And I eventually learned how to cook them and preserve them. And now I can get them just fine. But back then in California, things were hard. It was a rarity for me, for coastal Matsutaki specifically, But now they're abundant. They're all over in my freezer and in my canning jars, and it's something I thankfully take for granted, at this
Yes.
point in my life.
Yep. Yeah. I feel we get them pretty dialed in too. And it is nice to kind of know you can always get more. And I want to talk about the food part of Matsutaki because it's so important, and it's such a unique mushroom. But let's kind of keep talking about the mushroom and how we find it and where we find it and stuff like that before we break into the food part of it. Let's start by go kind of talk a little bit about the habitat from Northern California to Oregon, where you've been finding them, and maybe you could talk too about the pine. I call them the barrens, the pine trees that are further to the east of you too. And I'm going to load up a couple pictures of Matsutakis to show people.
Yeah, so I would say I would find them in as far south as the Sonoma coast. And this was all coastal hunting for me in California. Surely they grow in the Sierras there in the Southern Cascades, but my personal experience is on the coast, often on Sonoma, Mendocino, and Humboldt County coast. And there you have the tan oak trees, which is a common understory tree amongst noble pines. As you get a couple miles in from the ocean breakers, it often would start with exclusively noble pines as you come in from the ocean, and then slowly the tan oaks would start to incorporate their way in with Doug fir and spruce, and eventually hemlock trees would be more dominant as you really came into maybe 3 to 4 miles in from the ocean. And so as soon as you start finding those tan oaks, it wasn't the noble pines so much in my experience on the coast there, but it's the tan oaks and the rhododendron. You would often find Matsutaki in these dark, dense, multi-layered forests that typically 2 to 3 miles in from the ocean breakers. So that would be my experience.
And this
in
was
California.
in the winter, right? Was this like what time of year?
I would say at the end of porcini season, the beginning of, December would be a good month to look for. And honestly, the seasons have seemed to, with the change in climate, gone a little bit later and later every year. But I would often find them right before black trumpet and hedgehog season, and usually around Christmas time. I'd be really lucky if I saw baby black trumpets and hedgehogs. So I'm thinking very end of November, very beginning of December, I would be looking for Matsutaki on those coasts in the late 2010s or late 2007, 2008.
Now, and knowing they grow, I think all the way from, Mexico, all the way up to Alaska, I think. Talk about the Oregon habitat, kind of, because there's several different spot habitats in Oregon. You find them as well now.
Oh my gosh, the Oregon habitat's been so much fun figuring out over the years. I would say it started, of course, finding them in the lodgepole pine that grow on the coasts. And that's the same species that grows in the mountains, although it has a really different characteristic that grows on the coast. And we're happy to be lucky enough. By the way, Danny Barnum, who gave me the shout out, I love you earlier, he's an unexpected guest to this. He grew up in Florence in the middle of what I consider to be the prettiest mushroom hunting habitat I've ever come across in my life. And that's the Oregon Dunes. It's such a unique space. And you have such a diversity of habitat and such a unique habitat. And it's absolutely abundant with mushrooms in such a unique area because you're walking around in sandy moonscapes with patches of pine trees. I call them islands because you're in open, barren sand, and you have these little patches of pine trees here and there. Sometimes, several hundred acres of forest, and sometimes tiny little desert islands of pine trees in the middle of sand. And they associate with those pine trees, and a lot of rhododendron and lichen would grow around them. And they seem to like a very, what can I say, a very mature pine tree habitat in these islands amongst these sand dunes. And so the best way to describe it is you're walking, and you could be walking barefoot in 12 inches of deep, soft sand in little raises of earth, here and there, miniature hills, no more than 5 or 6 feet elevation from the path that you might be walking on. And on these slight raises, you'll see, in particular, what are they called? The Allotropa virgata, sugar sticks, these little mycorrhizal plants that grow with them. And often within 20 feet of that, you see Matsutaki buttons popping up, but not necessarily in the path. And when I say path, it's very loose. There are paths in the area we're going to, but it's such open landscape. You're walking everywhere and anywhere. That's one of the wonderful things about it. It's kind of a choose your own adventure forest opportunity or outdoor opportunity. Is absolutely incredible in the how you can manipulate your travels throughout your hike and your day and kind of clue into moisture levels and habitat maturity and kind of figure out where the right balance of lichen and pine trees and this particular plant called sugar stick
Let me show that
is going to grow.
Let me show that off here
for the
real quick,
Matsutaki.
Joseph. I don't know what I'm sharing here. There we go. Yeah, look here. Here's that. Here's a picture of that from those dunes. That kind of was what you were just describing. You could see the sand and the trail off to the side there. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me envious. I'm happy to be here with all of you now, but I wish I was out there. picking Matsutaki
Yeah.
right now.
And there's a couple of those old sugar sticks. That's probably what they look like in, I don't know, October, November. They're kind of dried out. And
yeah, and that's, you know, that's what you're looking for. They're very vertical, and but you know, in the springtime, in the summertime, when you see them, would probably be the most familiar sight that people who haven't seen it be like, oh, I've seen that before. Is it looks like this? I don't know if you have any fresh pictures of them, like when they're grown in the summertime, but they're very, very identifiable then, rather than just looking at, you know, the dead plants. But, you know, to the trained eye, once you learn the habitat and you look at, you know, surely anybody can go online and look at this plant and see its various life cycle stages. And essentially, when you're looking for the Matsutaki, it's at the end of its life cycle stage. And it'll have red and white stripes, and the branches or the buds of the flowers will be kind of like a candy cane type stripe, you know, wrapped around the top of it. Very interesting plant. It's extremely
it has to grow with Matsutaki, doesn't it? Like it lives with Matsutaki.
Yes, it's called a obligate parasite. It's extremely unique. The Matsutaki will grow with, I'm going to mispronounce all these families, but the Pinocaceae family, the Vigaceae family, and the Ergaceae family. And those three families envelop hemlock and pine, oak trees, and heath and heather rhododendron families. And the very last one, the Ericaceae family, is what the allotropa is with. And so, you know, not only is the allotropa in this family, but, you know, I'm curious, the kinnikinick, I bet, is in that family as well. And kinnikinick is a really, really common ground cover plant that I often find growing with those Matsutaki. So I'm curious if, you know, if it doesn't grow, you know, ectomycorrhizally with the sugar stick, but then prefers to grow within the slight shaded covered area of the actual kinnikinick, because I've certainly found them often growing in there. But who knows? Who knows? It's fun. Oh, there's the picture. Look at that. I mean, how can you not remember that when you see that in the forest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we love seeing those. It doesn't mean we're going to find them at that moment, but we know that they're going to be in that vicinity, hopefully at some point. And we'll come back and talk about the dunes, I think, in a little bit. Just run us through the other habitats, because I know we find them sometimes out of the dunes and then further east in the pines. If you could just run us through that real quick.
Yeah, and so the second most common habitat would be the pine trees in Central Oregon. What we call Central Oregon is still quite westernly, I think, as far as the borders of Idaho versus the Pacific Ocean go. When we say Central Oregon, we're talking about the crest of the Cascades, and as you go down in elevation, and before you hit desert habitat, and the tree, the forest ecosystem changes quite a bit as you get east of that, you know, that east side of the Cascade habitat. So as you get on the high side of the Cascades, you know, there's the beginning of pine, but also hemlock is often mixed in with there. But as you get just a little bit, you know, that 10 or 15 or 20 miles east of there, it often becomes exclusive pine habitat. And this is often volcanic sand based because of all the volcanic activity we've had over the millennia in Oregon. And that sand is also something the Matsutaki absolutely love. They don't often grow in rich soils. It's almost exclusively in a sandy, gritty soil, which is why they like the dunes, obviously, and which is why they're also so happy in the Cascades. And as that pine gets very exclusive and becomes the dominant tree in that forest, they just grow, and they don't grow necessarily with the rain patterns. They just grow with as the temperature drops, and it's often more associated with a more mature pine forest, but not exclusively. They just grow like crazy, and that's often where you get the hardcore commercial, professional Matsutaki pickers, Matsutaki, camps. That's where a lot of the famous stories come from and rumors that you've heard over the years. But that pine forest is kind of boring, to be honest with you. It's not the most exciting forest for me. But last year was the first year I really spent a lot of time in the pine forest, and we found a lot of Matsutaki in a very short amount of time every day. So
yeah, they are kind of a weird forest, and I think we're thinking, like, to me, in my mind, that's maybe east of Crater Lake there along, is that Chemult? That highway that runs south from Bend. It goes through all those kind of dry pine areas.
Yeah, it's, the pine tree has its advantage, in the ecosystem, in that it could take some pretty dry weather. So it's in the kind of the rain shadow there. So it could take a little more rain shadow than others. And, it's got its advantage. And then, of course, the Matsutaki's taking advantage of that and working with that. And it's kind of, I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of other mushrooms that are growing out there as far as commercial, viably pickable, or, traditionally edible mushrooms. It's the Matsutaki mushroom in September and November. There are exceptions to that.
And those pine trees, that's where, and John's asking about the time of year, right? It starts in the pine trees in September, and then the Cascades, and after that, and then the coast. Does it move in that direction, or?
That's a good question. I will say, a lot of these things that we talk about with an air of, authority, we might have 70%, confidence in saying. And I will say I have even less than that here. So, wow, what is it? I will say at the coast, I feel really comfortable starting to look for, as soon as any cool nights happen. And usually that's the very beginning of September or late August. But I'll tell you, I had a person in town show me a picture of her boyfriend with a big open number 3 Matsutaki in June this year, that they had found that, and that was taken that week. So in June this year, there was a Matsutaki fruiting in the dunes. So there's exception to this, but I found a Matsutaki, a couple Matsutaki last week, just lightly looking in the dunes, and I'm pretty confident they've been up for 2 or 3 weeks. So what's that? Beginning of September at the coast? Yeah, September 1st at the coast. The Cascades, you could probably get Cascade Matsutaki a little bit earlier than that. The local Forest Service says they sell the most Matsutaki permits in the month of September. So it might be kind of a simultaneous thing, the dunes versus the pine tree habitat. Now, that brings us, I think, if I may, to the other habitat that I pick. And it's one of my favorite habitats to pick, and that's the hemlock forest of the Cascades. So before you get really at the crest of the Cascades, both just west and just east of that crest of the Cascades, hemlock becomes a fairly dominant species up there. And I just love picking Matsutaki in that hemlock forest for a number of reasons. It's aesthetically exceptional, and no one else is picking mushrooms up there. I don't feel like I'm competing with commercial mushroom pickers in any way whatsoever. And you can have a space all to yourself, and you might even find Hericium or Boletus rexvaris or Boletus edulis. I don't know which one of those grows in the falls, technically in the mountains. Chanterelles. I mean, you could find a huge variety of mushrooms, but you can find an enormous quantity in the right spot with volcanic sand and volcanic influence. It's absolutely exceptional just west of the Cascade Crest in the Hemlock Forest. It's been some of my best days ever picking Matsutaki have been in that forest, and nobody else is doing it, and that's why.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hidden Matsutaki spots. And let me just kind of run through some other parts in the country. I know we've talked to people that find them in Maine, right along the coast. Somebody was telling us how she harvests them from sea kayaks. She kayaks around
Yes.
and finds them up above the water level just from the kayak. They are also found in Minnesota. In the upper Midwest, I think they're pretty rare. And if somebody has a spot, they're never going to share it with you. We have them here in Colorado. I'll share a quick screen here. This was a group we took out, not this summer, but last summer. And you can see it was in a pure pine stand. And we had like 25 of us in the woods. And I don't know if you can tell their baskets are full. The reason everybody is so clumped together there is we walked into the woods and they were everywhere. We probably didn't go more than 100 yards from this spot. There were so many of them in this kind of pine habitat. They also find them, and they say, it's funny, they say, I've heard somebody say they're north of I-70, and we've always found them south of I-70 in high elevation pines, but they also find them in the mixed conifer forest there as well. The same mushroom. So they grow all around the country. However, I think the big harvest and the big scene is where you are, in Oregon, especially, and up into BC. So for anybody that's looking, I just want to encourage you. We find them about the middle of August here in Colorado in those pine forests at about, I don't know, 9,000 feet maybe. Now I got two questions for you, Joseph, that came in. Maybe one. Somebody, John, is saying he found them in Trinity County, California, under tan oak. Stephen is asking about permits that are required for the non-pro hunters. And I'll let you start on that one. That's a tricky question.
It is tricky. It's a challenging. I'll tell you. I'll be as honest and forthright as I could be. I've bought commercial mushroom pit permits exclusively for Matsutaki only in the Lost Coast of California, and if I went back there today, I probably wouldn't do it again because there's not really anybody looking out there. But I don't. The worst feeling to me would be me picking a mushroom and feeling like I'm taking money away from somebody who paid for a commercial permit. So there's a few different things that you could do. I will say officially, you could pick I think 5 or 6 Matsutaki mushrooms on National Forest Service land, as well as the sand dunes, National Recreation Area, and you have to cut them in half so that they're not going to be commercially viable. If you were to be selling them, it would be crystal clear. So this is when you pick them, you cut them in half lengthwise, and that's what you do. And if you're caught by a forest ranger and they ask you to show you what you've done, you got to have those cut in half. It's not the same for any other mushroom, but the Matsutakis, because the Forest Service is making money off selling permits, they're going to manage that more than and I should say specifically Matsutaki permits. There's a different permit for Matsutaki in almost all forest habitats in Oregon. You have to have a special commercial permit for that. And so, it's one of those things. That's why I love the Hemlock habitat in the high Cascades. There are 0 commercial pickers. And in that particular national forest, they don't even identify it as a Matsutaki mushroom zone because there are no pine trees around. And so I really enjoyed that habitat. I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. I'm not doing anything. But when I'm in the dunes, I get my 5 or 6 Matsutaki. I'll cut them in half. And that's what I do. I'm never raking it in, with the Matsutakis at the dunes, but it's still so much fun to be there. And it's such an incredible habitat. I can't tell you how unique it is. it's like, it's, to me, it's like picking, edible mushrooms on a tropical island. It's just the most unique habitat. And so I love it, and I go and I do it. But my favorite is the Hemlock Forest in the high Cascades, because there's no one else to bother you. No one even is identifying that with the commercial mushroom picking area. It's just not, there's nobody there picking them,
Yeah, here's another picture of the dunes. And this hillside here had quite a few of them. And you can see in that picture, there's a red backpack. That's Kristen walking up in there. I stood back, and it's just like miles of this sort of territory. And it's so beautiful to walk through. So the kind of takeaway on the permit is it's different in every forest. However, it is a highly permitted mushroom, more than it seems like any others. So, do your research and follow the law. And I feel like if there's one mushroom that you got to respect and the rangers are going to get after you for and write you a ticket, it's probably this one.
And that's a culture that, was created in the 80s when there was a lot of money behind this market locally. And, fortunately and unfortunately for some people, that's changed a lot, and there's not any money in it. Buyers could be paying $1 a pound for number one mushroom, Matsutaki mushrooms, in the peak of the season now. And it's unfortunate for people who really have to make their living doing it like that. And it's unfortunate for recreational pickers that want to enjoy a day in the woods picking a mushroom that doesn't have as much rarity anymore. Because like you said, when this culture started for the rangers and for the Forest Service to sell these very expensive permits, and in some cases literally auction them off to pickers, that culture had to do with different economy than exists right now. And I think maybe in some cases those have changed. The permits might be a little bit cheaper, but I don't think in all cases. They're kind of stuck in 1985 still.
Yeah, back when they were very valuable and people were fighting over them and stuff like that. We got two more questions on location. Somebody's asking about Matsutaki and coastal Washington and the dunes there. I don't have any experience up north of, middle of Oregon. I don't know if you do.
I haven't. I was on a coastal Washington. I can't speak much for, but I would have to assume that they're there. I can't imagine them not being. And the main reason for that is the habitat for trees from this part of Oregon north all the way to the Olympic Peninsula is almost exactingly the same. There are very few trees that change. There's very few habitats that change very much. It's still volcanic. It's still temperate rainforest.
Yeah.
And I will say on one trip into the Mount Adams, I tried to summit Mount Adams a couple years ago, and that's in the three mountains, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, and Mount St. Helens, in that very special area of mushroom hunting that Landon Cook talks about in his books. I saw Matsutaki pickers all over the forest on that late September summit attempt, and they were walking across the road as you drove down. I mean, it was crystal clear there was Matsutaki picking. So it's definitely going on there. Their mountain habitat isn't different. If there's dunes on the Washington coast, right now would be a really good time to go out there and start looking.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about, since we've kind of gone through the habitat, we've talked about the allotropa indicator, we've talked a lot about volcanic soil and sand. And just to kind of wrap that up, another thing that we see, and let's talk about identifying them, and then maybe after that, grading them. I'm going to show a picture. They always have sand at the tip of them.
Yeah, they do.
And you can see here, this is in Colorado, I think. And if you look at the tips of these, they're growing in sand, but no matter where you pick them, even if it looks like it's dirt or duff, if you stick your finger down into the hole you just dug them out of, there's always that gray sand is always down there at the tip of this thing, like 110% of the time. There's a name for this. It's escaping me. Maybe some of our mycologists here can pop that into the chat. Unless, do you know what that's called? That sand?
I sure don't.
It's got a special name. I know that. So look at these ones here. Let's talk about maybe the identification process a little bit on these. How do you identify the Matsutaki?
Well, I'll repeat what I was told when I was trying to figure this out back in the day. Is it looks like someone spit some chewing tobacco on the top of them. There's a very tobacco stained cap to it that as you lift up the duft, even if it's a mushroom, as you move that little bit away, there's this. I mean, these are pretty clean, but that light brown, that little bit of hawkswing-esque, that old veil that was, partial veil that was covering the mushroom, that little bit of peeling away, that's crystal. I mean, that is just a telltale thing to look for. And if it's not that, it's a mock Matsutaki, which also actually has that same coloration often.
Yeah, let me show one of those.
So
yeah, so they got the color, they got the smell, which is
smell, and that pointy stem is critical. Pulling up this mushroom is absolutely critical, especially for the beginner.
Here's a little one. And I wasn't talking about the look-alike. I was talking about the Matsutaki that has that kind of, I don't want to say too pointy. It's kind of is that a wedge shape or it's kind of got a blunt point on it. And
sure.
There's a baby. But how do you describe the smell?
Oh, not mushroomy. And I say that it's such a generic term, but I think it's an important, since we're talking about mushrooms that might smell like almonds or might smell like one thing, or it's not a mushroomy smell, like not a cremini or portobello profile. And it's distinctly, to me, a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of that cinnamon.
That's what I smell, cinnamon. Some people say dirty socks. I don't know. It's like ineffable. What is it? It smells like Matsutaki. I think Kristen put it there in the chat. She said it's hard to deconstruct the smell. It really is. Gym socks with cinnamon in them. John just posted. So,
but you will smell something, and that's important, because I wouldn't say if I picked up Amanita phalloid at that stage, not only will it have that big button at the bottom of it, that big bulbous base to it, but it's also going to have, it's going to smell very mushroomy. And when I say mushroomy, I'm talking about commercial, grocery store mushrooms that are not wild mushrooms. And then that, always looking for a little bit of veil. Like, this is a great picture because it shows, a number 2 Matsutaki upside down, and that little bit of veil, you see how it's peeled away and you can see the exposed gills. But imagine what that veil is gonna look like as it pulls off that mushroom through its additional stage of growth, and kind of that veil just kind of sticks to the base of the mushroom, very much as a cap here. The cap is, that dark layer is old, dirty, decomposing veil is the best way I can describe that, right? And so as that veil peels off, the outside of the cap, it's going to fall down and kind of stick to the stem and create more of that coloration. And that's the tobacco, profile that, I read about years ago, and it's a very distinguishing. I mean, Trent, when you're in the woods, we're looking for Matsutaki in some of these habitats. The amount of white russulas that are growing is outrageous, especially in the Hemlock habitat of the high Cascades. And we're walking through, and for the most part, I would say we know from 10 feet away if it's 90% certainty if that's a white russula cap button or if it's a Matsutaki. What would you say is the difference between that before you even have to get down and examine it further? Because
I think they're less white. I think maybe there's a little more pop of white on the Rusula. I don't. Other than that, I'm not sure. Um, other ID characteristics to hop into and maybe discuss would be when you squeeze the stem. Boy, it is rock hard. Like you can squeeze the stem of a Matsutaki between your fingers as hard as you possibly can, and you will never like break the stem. And it's a little tough. Here's I guess a number 3 where the veil has completely come off of it. In Colorado, I want to show though before I want to show real quick
that even when I'm cutting them. I was gonna say, even when I'm cutting him, there's almost a squeak to it with the knife. When I'm cutting him for the kitchen pot, there's such a dense mushroom. There's a little squeakiness to it that is just really unique. It's a very rubbery mushroom.
Yeah, now take a look at this. This is the one we find a lot in nearby habitats, the Cataphalasma. It looks a lot like a Matsutaki. The good news is it's edible. I'm pretty sure ate this one. I'm not sure if we ate this very one, but I think we did. And for me, it smells completely different. What else do you look for to tell these apart?
For me, when I'm finding this mushroom, I'm in a different forest habitat than I am when I'm picking Matsutaki. Now that said, like in that habitat of the forest, I'm in more Doug fir, more spruce forests. There are pine around, but I'm not in the dunes anymore. And that's when I'm going to find this mushroom, maybe growing around some random Matsutaki, but I'm not in prime time Matsutaki habitat. And I'll see it and I'll say, hey, that might be a Matsutaki. And then it's crystal clear because it's the long stem.
Yeah. Look at the stem, everybody, on that.
It is just not a Matsutaki.
The stem is considerably longer. And in fact, you have to work to dig these out. Usually when you pick these, you break them. You break off half the stem. You don't get the whole thing. And look at the dirt at the bottom of the stem in there. I don't know if you guys can see that there. I'll highlight it right here. Whoops. That is not sand. That is dirt. And no Matsutaki is going to have such a long and pointy stem with a bunch of dirt at the bottom. Like John mentioned, it's a farinaceous smell. It smells like cucumber to me. That's the exact word I would use to describe the smell of this thing. And like I say, we do eat them. We peel all the skin off of them. It's off of this mushroom and saute it up, and it's a pretty good mushroom. It's not a Matsutaki though. I think the thing you want to watch out for though when you're picking these is that you don't actually pick an amanita, a poisonous amanita, which is going to smell different, and the stems you're going to be able to squeeze the stem right off on it. But they could be confused. So I think that's the one thing you're going to want to be really aware of. Let's see what else we got here, Joseph. We talked about the fruiting patterns a little bit, and your theory is it's not so much about the rain.
And I mean that's really not just my theory. That's me reading mushroom blogs years ago and presently, and that's kind of exciting about this mushroom. I mean, it's not the first mushroom I'm most excited to go for in the fall, but it's advantageous when you have cool nights. And maybe like this year, I mean, we did get some rain so far this year, but I'm not getting excited about going to pick porcini or chanterelles quite yet. I'm getting excited because I don't think we've had quite enough to really have a big fruiting pattern from those. But if I didn't have, arrangements on my weekend right now, I'd be going out to the coast and picking Matsutaki because I know they're there. It doesn't matter whether or not we had rain or not. And it's just the cool nights that they're just going to happen anyway. They're going to be there, and it's going to be fun, and it's incredible habitat to be hiking through. It's just beautiful. So it's kind of exciting. It's a great mushroom. If you haven't had a very wet fall, then you can take advantage of focusing more on the Matsutaki, because it's going to happen whether or not it's a very moist season or not. It's going to be there. Yeah. Very much like the spring porcini. If it's a really dry spring, and I've spent a couple weekends here and there figuring out the morels, and I realize no more rain's coming, I'll change steps and I'll go look for where the Bleus Rex Veris are going to grow in the Cascades, because they tend to fruit even when there's not a perfect rain pattern moving into the season. And this is one that you could utilize that in the fall, whereas the Rex Veris is something you utilize in the springtime. So
yeah. And just for everyone, we've gotten some of our best morel and porcini Rex Veris harvest with you. You know a lot about those mushrooms. We'll have to save that for another class, though. The Rex Veris would deserve a class all on its own.
I guess so. It's so hard to not talk about all the amazing trips we've had doing all these things, but it's I actually was a little nervous, because Matsutaki, I love to pick it, and I'm learning more and more every year, and I really felt like I solidified that pine habitat knowledge in the last couple falls for the Central Oregon. So I'm talking about that exclusive pine habitat east of the Cascade summits. I really feel like I figured that out finally over the last couple of years. But I love this mushroom for so many reasons. It's the cooking technique involved in it is more challenging, mm-hmm. and it's you can't just treat it like any other mushroom and get the best out of it. You really have to be subtle with your ingredients, and that's not something I inherently do. So it's a fun practice to be light-handed with my seasonings and focus more on delicateness and nuance, and that's exciting for me as a cook. And it should be exciting for anybody, that you're not going to laden this mushroom with garlic and onions and spice and fat. It doesn't like fat.
Let's talk about that. Let's switch gear. There are some questions we haven't answered about habitats and stuff, but let's talk about like getting them into the kitchen. And I think before we talk about the kitchen, let's talk about the grading of the mushrooms and what that means, and then cleaning them before you get them into the kitchen. Talk a little bit about those two things, and I'll show some pictures.
I'm very excited to talk about this, because the grading of a mushroom often dictates the price you're going to pay. And with this particular mushroom, paying for a number one, if you're not fortunate enough to have a habitat near you and you want to buy some, paying for a number one is not a critical requirement, because it's not necessarily the best representation of the flavors. Mm-hmm. The number one is a representation of how long it's going to last on the shelf for the guy who's selling that mushroom. And so and sometimes there's cultural reasons in Japanese society where the number one looks a little more phallic, and it's a little more important for springtime and cultural reasons. Basically, that's why that mushroom gets more mushroom in that culture, is because of the shape. But locally, I would say in America, you get more money for that mushroom because the buyer paid more for it, because he has 2 weeks to sell that mushroom rather than 3 or 4 days. And with that, the number one is a fully closed mushroom. There's no veil open on it whatsoever. It could be this big. It could be quite larger. That's a great picture. Thank you for that picture. The bottom left, that's a 4 or 5 ounce Matsutaki, I would have to say. The one in the bottom middle, that's a more traditional, you'll see these little babies, that's a classic number one that is unfortunately going to be most ones you see. And then on the right there, that's a partial veil. So that'd be a number 2. And number 3 would have the veil completely gone and be a little bit more wide open.
Yeah, so
I'd
this
still
one's
say
almost
that top
on its
middle's a
way.
number 2, but again, and when he says on its way, like he means, to number 3, but
Yeah.
this mushroom's going to last in the refrigerator for 2 weeks. These things, the density of them, we talked earlier about how strong they are. I mean, they are exceptionally long-lived mushrooms, in my opinion. Couple weeks in the fridge, no problem as a number 2. Most often. I mean, there's some exceptions if you're picking them at the very end of their life cycle, at the end of the season. Maybe they got frozen one too many times, in early freezes on the mountains. But in general, they've got a great life to them. And they could take a beating. So let's move on to that. And the flavor profile of a number 3 Matsutaki is just as good, and in my opinion, superior when fresh out of the woods to a number 1. I think those gills add a lot of surface area to add to the aromatics. So we talk about like a great wine and the exposure of a wine inside a giant goblet of wine glass. That big wine goblet is essentially showing off the seasoned air in that glass to more wine by had that larger surface area. There's no difference in that in the Matsutaki. All those gills, those exposed gills, it's a greater surface area. And as a chef, to me, that's a greater opportunity for influence into a broth. Often you're finishing these shaved into a boiling broth 3 minutes before you're actually going to eat it. And a dense little number 1 to me is not going to show off as much flavor, pound for pound into that broth as a number 3 that's in perfect condition sliced into that broth. That's my personal opinion. I'm sure there's plenty of room for discussion on that with other experienced Matsutaki pickers and eaters, but that's my opinion.
Yeah, I find the stems of the number 3s to be a little tough. So like maybe I'll cut them extra thin for what I'm using them for, just the stem, or maybe do something else with it rather than put it right into my food.
Yeah, and that's another good point is I would treat the stems on this mushroom very much like you would a tough cut of beef, in that you're cutting against the grain versus with the grain. And if this pen, is the mushroom stipe, the stem, I would cut it like this always. I would never cut it like this. Now, I might cut a porcini in this fashion because it's a little more of a delicate textured mushroom, and I might be desiring more toothsome, fleshy texture, depending on what I was trying to do with that particular porcini. But Matsutaki, I would never cut along the growth, the stipe. I would never cut it like this. It would always be like that. That's a really good point that you brought up right there. It's just going to be more, it's going to be edible and texturally acceptable, for our standards. And then for cleaning these puppies, that's a big thing because that's a big thing. And I'm going to possibly upset or frustrate some people in saying, I have, first of all, no problem washing my mushrooms appropriately.
Me too.
Right before I cook them, or maybe a day before I cook them. Okay, thank you. But this mushroom in particular, I'm going to wash it. I'm going to scrub it with a potato scrubber or something like that. I'm going to cut that little butt of stem at the bottom that you said, Sandy. I'm not even going to bother peeling that back with a knife because it's mine and my friends' opinions that there's actual sand inside the flesh of that mushroom at the base of the mushroom. So I'm going to cut that last inch off. I'm going to aggressively wash that mushroom, but it's not going to do anything really. Before I cut it, I'm going to wash it, but it's only going to get a small fraction of the sand off of it. I'm going to slice it, and then I'm going to wash it again. And I'm going to dunk it in one change of water and another change of water and back again. And every time I do that, and this is already sliced, ready for the pot. This is ready. This is the final presentation slice. we got to reiterate, this is a very strong, very firm mushroom. It could take some handling. It's not a delicate little hedgehog that's going to break in tiny little pieces. You know, this is a very firm, very structurally stable mushroom. So I'm going to have it sliced in whatever presentation cut that I want it in. And I'm going to put it in a pot of water, agitate it, lift it up out of that water because that sand is heavy and it's going to fall to the bottom. And then I'm going to move it into a new pot of water. I'm going to agitate it, and I'm going to lift that mushroom out of that water. Don't pour the water out into a strainer and strain the water out. You really want to lift it out because those heavy sand particles are going to float to the bottom. You're going to lift it out, and I'm going to do that 3 times. Sometimes I have a 2-compartment sink, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put them in one side of the sink, put them in the other while I'm draining this sink, fill the sink up again, pop it back again, and then it's good. It's good to go. And this is really a technique I'm employing right before I cook the mushroom.
Yeah, we like to wash it too. I will say though, the grit on the Matsutaki is so fine that it's not the worst sand to have in your mouth. You know, I wouldn't want it in a restaurant, but at the same time, it's also not like a big piece of beach sand in your teeth either.
And also I will say that when you are serving you and your friends or anybody other than yourself, if you agitate that, when you finally have the soup and the ramen, I had Matsutaki, completely random. Obviously this was happening tonight. I had Matsutaki ramen last night by a random occurrence, you know what I mean? And that bottom of that pot, even after I've went through all this trouble for the Matsutaki,
that soup,
the very, very bottom of the pot, I guarantee I can get a little bit of sand in the bottom of that pot. So don't, as you're serving it, don't over agitate that soup or broth or whatever you're making for your people. Don't over agitate it when you're serving them, and just be wary that very last cup and a half of food you're going to get out of that pot might have a tiny, tiny bit of sand in it, and just enjoy it for what it is.
And talk about it. I think this is like a really unusual mushroom, and there's other mushrooms we treat completely different, like maybe candy caps. My experience is any recipe that you use for a Matsutaki is only for a Matsutaki, and we treat it completely differently. So talk a little bit about how you like the strategy of cooking them.
So I would say number one is it's a water soluble flavor profile and not a fat soluble flavor profile. Surely there's somebody who's got Matsutaki flavor profiles, you know, exhibited through fat, but I personally would say that it's all about, you're not sauteing a Matsutaki, you're boiling it in a broth, or there's a high liquid component and a low fat component to your cooking technique. So, you know, since the very first time I bought those Matsutaki at the market, I've never sauteed a Matsutaki mushroom, not one time since then. And it just, that flavor is exhibited best through liquid and not fat. So I'm often using noodles and broth or rice, putting it in rice. But you're very nuanced seasoning. I've many times thought, oh, it could take just a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that, and then lost the Matsutaki profile. You know, I mean, this is something you might not even want. It's more of a chicken broth direction than a beef broth direction. And for me, I don't use any of those meat broths at all too much these days. It would be, you know, I'll tell you, last night I made this vegetarian ramen, and all the classic aromatics, ginger, garlic, onion, in water. And I actually poached about a cup of morels in there just for a little bit of depth of flavor. Just poached them in the broth, strained them off. Just had the broth there, and just that tiny bit of morel added, just enough. But I was so nervous about that move. The potential of ruining that dish was, I had anxiety about making that decision right there. And a little bit of soy sauce, and then that was my base.
Yeah.
That turned out just fine. But you got to be so careful. You got to be so careful with this mushroom to not add. Gosh, what would it be an example of things that people? I mean, smoked paprika, anything smoked seasoning wise. If you add like a spice, that's awesome. It doesn't matter, but make sure it's something that adds heat but not flavor. So I wouldn't add habanero to it. I would add chili de arbol, like your classic red chili flake, or Thai chili. But I would never add like a habanero type spice or chipotle. That would be out of the question for this mushroom. I added jalapeno to my broth last night, but a clean, jalapeno just boiled, and you wouldn't. Goodness, I'm trying to think of great examples. You wouldn't use roasted garlic. You would use garlic. Like you think of every ingredient really needs to be. Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, like the basis for Chinese cooking is like ginger, scallion, garlic. We call it GGS, in culinary school. But you just got to be really careful, and you almost just start. If for somebody who's new to cooking matsutake, I would say start with cooking rice with matsutake in the rice. I would start off with that simple dish, and then adding other more flavorful, ingredients as you go with your experience with the mushroom, and definitely overdo it one time. As they become more abundant in your life, overdo it and see how far you can push it. See where you can go with it. But it's not something that could be overwhelmed. I'll tell you one thing, the coolest Matsutaki flavor I ever had was a Matsutake cider. And I'd try to make Matsutake infusions into alcohol before, but it was with cooked Matsutake infused into alcohol. Maybe a cooked broth, and then that broth diluted a higher quantity of alcohol. Yeah. And the successful Matsutake flavored cider that we had, this was so flavorful to some people. It was so Matsutake flavored that it was overwhelming to them. And these are experienced mushroom, hunters that were drinking this, and thirsty ones too. So, I mean, it was really too much for them. They froze the Matsutake first, and essentially the theory was that it broke down the cell walls, and then infused more appropriately into the cider for that reason. They froze it uncooked, and it was incredible. So that's something, everybody out there listening, you want to play around with stuff, try infusing Matsutake flavor profiles raw into stuff, kombucha or whatever. Just have fun with it. I mean, there's always that nervous thing about, raw mushrooms, but it worked. No one got sick off this cider, and it was frozen first, so who knows? But it was never cooked. I know that.
We've done. We really enjoy making a shrub out of it, mixing it with vinegar and sugar and cooking it, and then using that like a drink in our soda water. It's refreshing. One of my favorite preparations is just when we catch them in the woods and bring them out, we marinate them a little bit, like in an Asian marinade, and then just put them right on the grill, especially the big number 3 caps. Cut the stem off. The gills hold all that flavor. Grill them up, and they're kind of fun to eat. Or you can stick, what are those sticks you put through things before you grill them? Shish kebabs.
Skewers. The French would call them brochettes, if you want to get fancy. I agree with you that the grilled thing, I was really nervous about saying, don't put grilled things or roasted things or, with Matsutake, because I'm sure somebody out there tonight has heard like, oh, grilled Matsutake is a classic thing. But I think it's that those little bit of grill marks, lightly grilled Matsutake, that little grill mark is really complementary with cinnamon profile. And I think that's what it is. When I've done it many times. I think but you also got to be careful, in my opinion, about the rubberiness of that Matsutake. For me, it's really about making sure there's enough moisture marinated on that Matsutake before you grill it. And in this one case, fat probably would be appropriate. And yeah, there's something about that little grill, that little char you get from the iron component of the grill and on the Matsutaki, that little bit of Maillard reaction, that caramelization of the proteins in the mushroom is really complementary to the cinnamon profile of the mushroom. But I've also done it and had my heat too low on the grill, and I was almost dehydrating the Matsutaki, as I grilled it. And so that was an error that I wouldn't want to repeat. Yeah, I think it's a high heat type grill, a nice marinade and then a high heat. If you do a nice marinade at low heat, you're dehydrating the mushroom on top of there and it's become too chewy. So I think that's an important component, a nuanced, important thing there.
What about preservation? How do we put them aside and enjoy them all year? What do you like to do?
Well, let me see. You could do two things, in my opinion. Well, I guess I'll add three, because I've had your pickled Matsutakis, and your pickled Matsutakis are outrageously good. I mean, blew me away. Just blew me away.
And that recipe's in our book.
That recipe is so good. It's a whole new pickled mushroom. To me, it's a brand new pickled mushroom that I've never had before. I'm comparing this to, you only had pickled cucumbers your life, and you just had your first pickled cucumber on a hamburger. You know what I mean? I'm just trying to put this in perspective. Like, it's a brand new category. That's a really good recipe. Anyway, so the two ways I will do it is always liquid based. I will prepare my Matsutakis as I discussed before, the aggressive washing, the aggressive slicing, and the dunking. And then I'll put them in a pot. And I'm usually doing this with a large amount of Matsutaki. So I'll put them in a pot and I'll fill the water level up to about, let's say it's a 6-quart saucepan. The water level is going to be about 3/4 of the way up. I'll put a lid on that pot and I'll boil those mushrooms. And as the cell structure breaks down, the mushrooms will fall into that liquid, and there'll be a thick, mushroom broth at that point.
So just a little bit of liquid at the bottom of the pot with a lot of mushrooms on top.
Yeah, you can always add more liquid, but really you're steaming that Matsutaki, that big pile of Matsutakis, and they're going to fall into their own liquid as well as a little bit of liquid that you added. The error here is, when I first did this, I would fill the water up to the top and I'd boil it. And at the end of the day, I have a lot of Matsutaki broth, but it might be 3/4 broth, 1/4 Matsutaki when I go to the freezer. The broth is the money. Like, you need the broth. The mushroom's good. It's great. But that broth is incredible. It's exceptional. And that broth is what you're going to use where the majority of your flavor is going to come from in that Matsutaki. Just like a truffle, all the fat's going to come from the infusion, or the flavor is going to come from the infusion of the flat fat. With the Matsutaki, all the flavor is going to come from the infusion into the liquid. So that broth is critical, and treating it as so is important to your recipe. So last night, for my broth, I started with a little bit of regular liquid for my vegetable broth base, but I'd say 3/4 of that liquid that I ended up cooking my noodles in was Matsutaki that I froze in their broth from last year. And so I started with my base, of aromatics and garlic and ginger and scallion and chili. But then I strained all that stuff off and I had liquid vegetable broth. And then I just piled all these frozen Matsutaki ice cube on top of it. It was so convenient. I mean, it was so darn convenient. Mm-hmm. And it's so easy. If you're going to have any freezer space taken up, Matsutakis cooked in their own broth is critical.
Yeah. And that's what we do too. I like to freeze them in my freezer bags in really thin layers, like that thin, so that I can open the freezer bag. And I'm sorry to admit this, I love ramen soup. Like, boom, I'd love to make a ramen for lunch and put some stuff in it to make it, add vegetables to it. And then I can just break off, a couple tablespoons of basically an ice cube worth of broth and put it right into my single ramen serving, and it's perfect. The first time I did it, I froze big blocks, which they have so much flavor. I often wanted just, a little bit in my rice or a little bit in my soup. So now I freeze them real thin so I can snap off a little bit at a time.
And then the other thing, I have a pressure canner, so I have the advantage of being able to can mushrooms, low acid items. And if anyone out there doesn't know the difference of this, your typical jams and things like that you could do with water bath canning because they have acid and sugar in them. But a Matsutaki's, is in a special place for that. And I don't believe you could just water bath mushrooms for canning without the addition of acids and things like that. So the same technique I told you about that I would use for the Matsutakis for freezing them, I can put those in a jar and can them for, I'm just guessing, it's 45 minutes to an hour under, 10 pounds of pressure, and I could have them shelf stable. And that the flavor of the Matsutaki is very, very well preserved. The texture, I can't believe there's not a product commercially available. I mean, I guess it would be kind of Huitlacoche-esque, obscure canned good, super decadent mushroom option, but I'm surprised there's not something like that available commercially. It's the flavor comes through. It's very, very good. It's very.
Do you put a little like citric acid into the water? Is that to help it achieve the correct chemical balance, pH balance, I should say?
I haven't done this in 3 or 4 years, to be honest. Mostly I got a chest freezer now, and I've been freezing them for the last few years, but I'd never put any citric acid in because I didn't have to, because the pressure canner allowed for that. I did put the only thing I put in there other than mushroom, and I honestly didn't really need to do this, but I put a little soy sauce in there, but that had nothing to do with the preservation. I put a little soy sauce in there, but
okay,
I did this 3 years in a row.
Let me jump in there because I was hoping John is on this. I was hoping he was going to weigh in here because he cans Matsutaki and he's canned them for years, and I'm hoping he's going to give me a sample of his 20-year-old Matsutakis. He says they're delicious when they're canned. He says he puts in a teaspoon of vinegar per quart to lower the pH and prevent the botulism. And he said yes. So John, I think that's a yes, that maybe I'll get to try your 20-year-old pickled or your 20-year-old canned Matsutaki.
And that's the rule for canning or pressure canning. The opportunities for the home chef, to do that. If you add acid to these traditionally non-cannibal products, you could do everything you could do with a pressure canner. You just have to add the acid, but then you're married to that acid, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just for me, I just to keep all my options open. And I had a pressure canner. I was like, well, let's avoid the citric acid, and then you won't have that requirement to follow you through with throughout the dish, whatever you end up doing that with in the future. So I'm
going to show a little screenshot here of a couple of fun preparations of Matsutaki on the we had a lot. So this was a fermented, we were trying to, I forget the word for it. It turned out to be pretty gross and we threw it out. We had some saran wrap on top to hold them down. And then the next one, this is a pickled Matsutaki. And those were the ones that were our favorite. They were delicious. However, they didn't hold up very well over a long period of time. They were really good for a month or two. And then in the middle are freeze-dried Matsutakis, which are awesome. They really preserve the flavor better than drying. I'll ask you about what you think about drying, dehydrating in a minute. And then we have canned Matsutakis, and that's Matsutaki shrub. And over on the right, I'm not really sure what that is at all. So that was like a day of work. We did that with Graham Steinruck. I don't know if anyone knows him. That was one of our little efforts with him after we found a bunch of Matsutaki. So there's a lot you can do with them. Can you talk about drying, dehydrating?
I haven't. Back years ago, in California, I dehydrated some Matsutaki for no other reason. I didn't have my pressure cooker then, and I did that, and I rehydrated them once, and I didn't get, when it just traditional heat drying, I wasn't able to get any of the original flavor of the there was mushroom flesh, but I didn't find it to be the best technique for dry for that mushroom,
Yeah,
But
I
you
did have
have
some
a
luck. I had
freeze
some luck
dryer,
drying
so
them, but it seemed like, especially by year two, they had really lost their flavor profile completely. But in year one, they were kind of fun to crumble into some soups, but they were not near as good as frozen. And I've also frozen whole buttons, wrapping them in saran wrap. But first, I put them in the freezer, then wrap them in saran wrap, and then wrap them in tin foil, and then put them in a good freezer bag and little buttons. And they, you can freeze a whole button that way. It's kind of fun. And I've tried it with just the saran wrap and just the tin foil, and it didn't hold up very well. But all said and done, it was a lot of work when I could have just frozen them in a broth and called it good instead of freezing them raw. So I think that it seems like the broth is the way to go, whether you freeze it or can it, unless you have a freeze dryer, which works too.
And then I guess my other favorite way to cook them is that radish cake or turnip cakes, what they're called. They're called turnip cakes. I can't remember the
daikon,
the term for it. Yeah, they're really daikon cakes, but that's just a special way to cook them for me. The texture of the mushroom for that is, that's, anyway, I just wanted to put that word in there because that's just one of my favorite ways to cook that mushroom. If it wasn't a broth, this is an example of utilizing that broth in something that's not a soup, because I'm not a soup guy. I'm not a broth guy. It doesn't never. I have to eat ramen and then I'll eat a sandwich afterwards to feel full. It doesn't satisfy me. But that's a good way to enjoy the matsutaki without.
And it was good
without it being.
That's something you contributed to the cookbook, and you basically combined radish and matsutaki and blended it, and then you steamed it, and then you let it cool, and then you sliced it. And then you fried it.
Yeah, it's a little bit more work, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, so good.
More work,
oh my gosh.
But it's a good matsutaki dish in my opinion.
You talk for a minute about that dish, and I'll pull the picture up and show it. It was crazy good.
It's a classic dim sum dish that they would call turnip cake on a menu if you were at a dim sum restaurant, and it utilizes mushrooms and meat and rice flour that would be formed into a glutinous cake. And there's nothing exciting about these terms that I'm using, a glutinous cake, but it's a glutinous mass in the fleshiness of the mushroom and the texture of the rice. I want to say gluten, but I don't know if that's the appropriate term. It creates this very fleshy element, and you're using you're using broth from the matsutaki, the flesh from the matsutaki, and you're able to slice and sear it in a really incredible way. I enjoy meat, but I really enjoy getting incredible textures and depths of flavors and umami from not utilizing any meat at all. And this is one of those dishes that does two things. It does that, which I really love, and then it also shows off a mushroom in its best form, in my opinion, in utilizing all the right techniques for it. And so that's why
we gobbled these up.
I particularly love this dish.
Yeah, it was so good. We could have lived off these, eating them every day. They were so absolutely delicious, but a lot of prep time too. Can you see the picture there, Joseph, that I just put up?
Yeah, I could see it. You know, it's a lot of prep time, but it's also the existence of this dish in the Asian culture where it hails from is you made the glutinous rice thing is like done the night before, and it's part of another component of dinner, and then it's like the leftovers, like fried rice. It's like the next day you have this thing left over. What are you gonna do? Well, fry it up, and it's a breakfast lunch item. It's like a leftovers dish.
Yeah.
That you know, the main event usually was from the night before, but this dish is gained more popularity perhaps because they traditionally fry it up the morning after. So it's you really the day of, you know, this is a great dinner party dish in my opinion. If you have a lot of time leading up to an event, you can have something really fancy and really special and take your time to do it. And then the day of the event, you're just searing a, you know, just like searing a piece of, you know, ahi tuna and putting it on a plate. It's the easiest thing in the world. You know, it's a very easy presentation. So, you know, in one hand, it is more time consuming, but.
Let me show another one you did that was pretty good.
Go ahead.
I zoomed in on this. This really featured like a lot of Matsutaki. I think we took a big bag of that frozen Matsutaki that we preserved in the water, and you made meatballs out of it. You strained the liquid out, and then you cooked up the Matsutaki into these meatballs, the meat of the Matsutaki, and then you made this white gravy. The picture's not very good because it's a lot of funny colors. But boy, did that feature the Matsutaki flavor beautifully.
Yeah. And you know, one of the even easier than everything else we've talked about is years ago for a mushroom event, I made Matsutaki rice cakes. And so you just get a glutinous white rice, any white rice really, and you cook it with the Matsutaki and all the classic, you know, things. You just put Matsutaki in the water. The Matsutaki is getting cooked as you boil the rice. That rice, you know, you could put in a food processor and you pulse it until it becomes this glutinous ball. And that ball is, you know, this wonderful cake that you could just form into a patty or whatever you might want to do. And it sears very well. The caramelization that's possible from this mushroom and the rice works out really, really well. And so you form it into a patty or a cake or whatever you want to do, and you sear it up, and then you can serve it with literally anything, any dipping sauce you can imagine. You can put it on top of a salad. You can have it as the main event over, you know, other cooked vegetables. You could turn it into a dumpling and put it in soup. I mean, there's so many things you can do with those two ingredients, just rice and Matsutaki. I mean, the sky is the limit. And, you know, you just, the only mistake you're going to get is over seasoning, you know, anything that goes into that. But, you know, let me even doing that's a learning experience because you see how far you can take it.
Let me show one here. This is how I usually
that
probably make it the most. That's a ramen dish with some dashi, and really instead of using, I guess, shiitake, which is the traditional ramen mushroom, we use the Matsutaki. And those are, I think those are actually freeze-dried Matsutakis floating on the top there. But that's also in the cookbook, and that wasn't one of your recipes, but it's still pretty good. And I guess I don't know why, I just love I love Matsutaki in my ramen.
I have a special place in my heart for ramen. It's just absolutely incredible. It's an incredible dish. I made it last night. It just, you know, when the cool temperatures came by and I had Matsutaki dying in the freezer with more Matsutaki to go out and pick fresh, you know, it was a no-brainer to get that in my belly.
I was just gonna see if we had any other kind of good, in the book, we have a Matsutaki Tom Kha recipe. We have the pickled Matsutaki. We have a Matsutaki fig jam, which is really good. Matsutaki meatballs from you. What else am I missing here? The pickled Matsutaki. I guess that's kind of it without pulling out my copy here and looking it up. We have a lot of Matsutaki recipes in the book, I think, is a reflection of all the ways that we like to eat it. So let's see. I think we're kind of coming up on the end here. I wonder if we should have any closing remarks on the Matsutaki. Do you ever make any desserts with it? Is there such a thing?
There's no reason why it wouldn't make sense. I haven't done it. I've done alcohol infusions as far as weird Matsutaki stuff go. I got a job one time based off my input off of Matsutaki alcohol infusion. Came up in the interview. It was just weird coincidence. But I told him it was a bad idea. And I think I'm correct about that. I don't really think Matsutaki alcohol infusions work well. Yeah, I might experiment it again in the future, but it would be freezing the Matsutaki and doing a fresh infusion rather than cooking it. The alcohol, the cider thing worked out really wonderfully.
Was that an alcoholic cider that you made?
What was the question again? Other weird Matsutaki things?
Any desserts or anything? We've kind of
desserts. The desserts, I've never done the dessert, but it would lend itself to like maybe a sabayon. I just don't know if you can get a very Matsutaki and concentration of flavor. Those two things don't go hand in hand, and dessert's often a focus of concentration of flavor. So I'd be curious if maybe you could poach them in some cream and then whip the cream and then put that whipped cream on something. These would be things I'd experiment with, but I'm not much of a sweets guy, so it's not the first place I go.
Kristen's got one for me to share. That's the Matsutaki fig jam with half figs and half Matsutaki, kind of made into not like a preserved jam, more like a fresh jam to eat. That could be a dessert, and that's from Chad Hyatt, who has a really good mushroom cookbook out, and he's also doing the Mount Pisgah event this year that's coming up here in a couple of weeks. So I guess maybe it's time to kind of talk about what's next. Now, one thing you've done traditionally is you've cooked the Mount Pisgah dinner for all the volunteers for the last several years now. And are you going to be involved in the virtual affair this year?
Not at all. No, I'm happily taking this year off. So it's totally fine. I'm going to involve myself as a participant this year. That often took away a lot of my time to really enjoy my local fun events. So I'm going to take advantage of it.
I think it might be the biggest wild mushroom event in the country, the Mount Pisgah. I'm guessing 10,000 people come through there in a day. I don't know the numbers. They're vast. It's a huge event.
It's a big event. It's one of the coolest mushroom shows I've been to, and I've only been to a few of them, but I really enjoy it. And it's a big effort to raise money for one of our local outdoor spaces close to our city. So it's an important event.
Okay.
And
well, as we wrap up, what's the weather? What's the weather look like for you?
Well, right now it's pretty classic Matsutaki weather. It's cool and not raining. So everything is telling me go pick Matsutaki. But the mountains are a little shut off for me right now because of fires. And I haven't been able to make it out there as I normally would, but the coast is definitely. I picked Matsutaki last Monday. I picked a couple Matsutaki, just a quick hour into the sand dunes on my way to do other things, and picked a couple Matsutaki. I saw a commercial picker or two, and I kind of backed off and took advantage of other great opportunities out there. But they're out, they're up for sure, and I can't imagine it's going to be a great year. We'll probably get more rain at the end of this week, and then things will be off to normal again. So
Okay, well, we'll be out there in 2 weeks. We'll try to hook up with you and do a little foraging and feasting while we're there. So thank
we
you.
definitely will be doing
Thanks
that,
for,
and I think your timing is going to be perfect this year.
yeah, I do too. Thanks so much for sharing all your Matsutaki wisdom with us, and we'll see you soon. Thanks everybody for coming in and listening and asking all those good questions. And we'll see you guys all soon. Thanks.